So good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Sylvia and Irving Margolis lecture today on March 1st. My name is Ruth Van Bernus, and I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Sylvia and Irving Margolis lecture on the Jewish experience in the American South. The Margolis lectureship was made possible by generous gifts from Alan and Gail Fields and Gary and Sandra Smiley. The lectureship honors Gail and Sandra's parents, Irving and Sylvia Margolis. Irving and Sylvia were longtime residents of Williamston, North Carolina. Gail's father, Irving Margolis, co-owned and ran a clothing business for 52 years, and Sylvia was the first Jewish teacher in Williamston school system. Then, thanks very much to Zoom, Alan and Gail Fields and Gary and Sandra Smiley are here tonight with us, along with their extended family. And I'm so sorry that you cannot see them. Major gifts have played an important role in what we've been able to accomplish over the last years. But so has annual giving, and we owe a great debt to all the alumni and friends who have supported us. March 30th is UNC's 4th annual Giving Day. Give UNC. We are asking that if your situation allows you, support us on that day. We have a generous donor who is going to match each gift made to the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. You can also make your gift tonight via this link, and it will be matched and count toward our totals on Give UNC. I'm very grateful that our speaker was able to join us tonight. We were hoping very much to host her in Chapel Hill, but we will do this on another occasion. Amy Milligan is the Batten Endowed Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies and Women's Studies and the Director of the Institute of Jewish Studies and Interfaith Understanding at Old Dominion University. She's an ethnographer who is particularly interested in lived experiences of gender, sexuality, and religion. She has widely published, and I just want to mention here her 2 books. In 2014, she published Hair, Headwear, and Orthodox Jewish Women, Kala's Choice. And in 2019, she published Jewish Body Lore, Feminist and Queer Ethnographies of Folk Practices. Amy Milligan had also studied small or marginalized Jewish communities, as we will hear tonight. But before I give her the floor, or rather the screen, I would like to mention one more publication many of you might be interested in, at least everyone in North Carolina. In 2018, she published the article, The Jewish Zealots of Tobaccoland, the Circuit Riding Rabbi Project's Impact on Small Town Jews in North Carolina, 1950 to 1980, in the journal Jewish Culture and History. And I really learned from this article. So please join me in welcoming Amy Milligan.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you tonight. If you give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides and images this evening. Okay. Ruth, it's good to go. You can see the screen? Okay, great. As you just heard, my name is Amy Milligan, and I teach at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Before I begin tonight, I want to thank the generous donors who made this evening possible, as well as the amazing faculty and staff of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. It's truly my honor to offer this year's lecture on the Jewish experience of the American South. I also want to warmly welcome the Selma Jewish community, many of whom are here with us tonight. I especially want to take a moment to acknowledge the profound grief and loss the Selma community recently experienced with the passing of Joni Gibeon Looney, one of the temple's 4 remaining members. Joni was 1 in a million, and I'm grateful to be entrusted to tell a part of her story here tonight. It's 2016, and I'm sitting in my office. My cell phone rings, I see a text from my friend Amy. A few weeks ago, we had been talking, and she told me that she was about to go on an interfaith civil rights tour with some students. I asked her what Jewish sites they were seeing, and she told me they hadn't found one yet. We talked about possibly checking out Selma because, like many folks, we had heard stories about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and other Jews who had marched in Selma. I picked up my phone, and there was a text that would change my life. She wrote, "I'm at the temple in Selma, Alabama. You will just love them. Maybe you could write about them. I'll email you as soon as I get home." The rest, as they say, is history. Initially, I resisted because I'm not a historian, and I didn't feel like what I did was really write about civil rights history. No problem, because it turns out that isn't the story that needs to be told. By training, I'm a folklorist and an ethnographer. Folklore is often misunderstood to be just about fairy tales and superstition. And while folklorists do study both of these topics, I, like many other folklorists, study the transmission of vernacular culture. What I mean by that is that I study our cultural DNA. Folklorists study the stories, knowledge, and practices of people. They explore memories and traditions and talk about the vibrancy of the things that we create as expressions of our identity. For example, in this photograph that you're seeing right now, you'll see Ronnie, Charles, Joni, and Hannah, each sitting in the pew that is where their family sat during services. Obviously, they no longer sit this far apart, but this image tells a story, doesn't it? I'll let you imagine the other image that you don't see, a picture of me perilously leaning over the very narrow second-story balcony behind the pipe organ, all done in the name of good ethnographic research. You see, that's the other part of who I am as an academic. I also am an ethnographer. This is a research methodology which involves studying a particular group of people, especially by living with them, interviewing them, and allowing them to shape the story over a long period of time. This means that I enter my research not to prove a certain hypothesis, but to tell the story, to tell a snapshot in time. I then take these snapshots and I put them in a larger context, both historic and cultural, to weave together a narrative that speaks to the lived experiences and the feelings of the people and communities that I study. Tonight, during our time together, I'm going to offer you some historical context for the Jewish community in Selma. And then I'll offer you a series of snapshots through storytelling in the hope that you might also come to appreciate Temple Mishkan Israel and its congregation as much as I do. In the last 5 years, I've interviewed nearly 100 people who have connections to the temple, many of whom are listening tonight. I've also interviewed Jews who grew up and left Selma, the children and grandchildren of the congregation, and local Selmians who care about the temple, even though they aren't Jewish. Unfortunately, I won't get to share all of their stories because, to be honest, that would take days. But I hope that they can hear themselves in the stories that I do share and know that I treasure the memories that they've told me and will recount them in my larger manuscript. The majority of our time tonight will focus on the 3 remaining members of the congregation who still live in Selma. Together, we have laughed, we have cried, and we have had a lot of good food. All in all, I've recorded over 300 hours of stories and memories, and these recordings are partnered with countless emails, personal interactions, field notes, and 3 summers of hunting through archives across the US for other Selma Jewish treasures. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the beginning. Jewish settlers came to Selma prior to the Civil War, many coming as early as the 1830s. Similar to other Jewish communities in the South, early Jewish settlers were primarily merchants and peddlers, many of whom were Sephardic. Ashkenazi Jews would later arrive in Selma around 1840 and again during the 1880s. Although our time tonight will focus on the telling of the story of Temple Mishkan Israel, it's important to also note that initially there were 2 synagogues in Selma. As Jews moved to the city, they first worshipped in private homes. Eventually, B'nai Abraham, an Orthodox temple, and Temple Mishkan Israel, a classically reformed temple, were established. Unfortunately, B'nai Abraham disbanded due to declining membership in 1944, and its members merged to join Temple Mishkan Israel. TMI, who had their acronym long before the popular internet slang of TMI, meaning too much information, came into existence, formed in 1867. Meeting in the homes of Joseph Meyer and later Adolf Elkin, Temple Mishkan Israel was officially formed in July of 1870 and began holding services in Harmony Hall in September of the same year. Harmony Hall, or the Harmony Club, had been established 3 years prior in 1867. This impressive 3-story building stands proudly in Selma's downtown district and was the social club for the Jewish community. During a time when Jews were banned from social and civic organizations, the Harmony Club offered dances, card games, billiards, poker, and numerous other social functions. The club later would be purchased by the Elks Club in the 1930s and then purchased by a private owner who now uses it as a residence and has it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. After worshiping at the Harmony Club for several years, the congregation began renting space from the Episcopal Church while they planned for their building. In June 1899, construction began, and February 1900, the building was officially dedicated. Before I visited the temple for the first time, several people told me that it was beautiful. To be honest, I smiled and internally brushed off their comments. As someone who studies Jewish communities, I've yet to find one that doesn't love their temple, so I assumed that this would be the same. However, the first time I stepped into the sanctuary, it literally took my breath away. It is a 2-story Romanesque revival building with impressive wooden pews with delicate scrollwork, an elaborate pipe organ situated above the bema, and you can see that's the platform I was sort of peering over with my camera, and imposing stained glass windows that illuminate the entire space. The chandelier that used to hang in the sanctuary is no longer there, but one can imagine its presence in the impressive room. It truly is breathtaking. One historic document discussing the leadership of TMI writes, "Selma's rabbinate is as interesting as it is varied. Indeed, Temple Mishkan Israel has been served by full-time rabbis, unordained cantors, rabbinic students, and as we'll focus on tonight, dedicated laity. I have also been lucky enough to interview numerous student rabbis who got their start at Temple Mishkan Israel, many of whom credit their time there to shaping the trajectory of their entire career. TMI's congregational membership peaked at 104 households in 1940 and has unfortunately been in steady decline since then. They have not had a full-time rabbi since 1976. Since then, the congregation has relied on rabbinic students, and especially in the last 10 years, their own congregational laity for all aspects of religious life. If you ask Selmians what they know about the Jewish community, they most likely will tell you that the downtown streets were full of Jewish shops. Indeed, Jewish merchants dominated downtown Selma for many years. Broad Street was lined with stores, Kaisers, Leopolds, Teppers, just to name a few. In addition, there were numerous other Jewish businesses: Elsie Adler Furniture, Siegel Automobile Company, Benishmeyer Tobacco, Thalheimer Liquors, and that doesn't include all of the other wholesalers or cotton merchants, or the shops along Alabama Avenue or Water Street. Barton's, Benderski's, Eagles, Lilienthal's, Boston Bargain, the list goes on and on. Perhaps best known outside of Alabama was Morris Hohenberg's cotton business, established in 1879. Beyond his impressive influence on the cotton industry, Hohenberg also was active at Temple Mishkan Israel, holding numerous temple leadership positions, and eventually having the social hall, part of the temple building, named for him. Also particularly influential is Benjamin Schuster, a prominent hardware merchant in the early 1900s, a jury commissioner in Dallas County, and a member of the governor's staff. His son-in-law, Walter Block, was also active in temple life, as well as the city's political and civic life, including being president of Selma's chapter of the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the city school board. In fact, when he died in 1933, stores throughout Selma closed for his funeral in recognition of his contribution to the city. Just as the history of the Jewish community of Selma cannot be separated from the history of the city of the city of Selma cannot be separated from its Jewish history. As Jews became socially accepted in the United States, they flourished in Selma. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Jews held public positions, including the city attorney, water commissioner, and served on the city council and the school board. Likewise, they also served as president of the Kiwanis and were prominent in the Masons. Most notably, there have also been 3 Jewish mayors of Selma: Simon Mas, Marcus J. Meyer, and Louis Benish. Only Benish was a native-born Alabaman. Mas and Meyer were both German immigrants. Other prominent political figures include Democratic Congressman William Layman, who represented the 13th and 17th districts of Florida from 1973 to 1993 and was Selma born and raised, and Mark Sleva, who served as fiscal director of the US Navy, general counsel to the Secretary of Defense, and later as the Assistant Secretary of Defense from 1949 to 1951, helping to merge the Navy and War Departments to create the new United Department of Defense. I suppose this is the point in our time together where you're beginning to question when I'm going to talk about civil rights. And it's true. It's inevitable that you cannot talk about Selma, Alabama without talking about civil rights. I don't want to minimize the importance of what happened in Selma, the 3 bridge crossings, Bloody Sunday, the march from Selma to Montgomery, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, or the iconic image of King and Heschel marching arm in arm. But I do want to suggest that this is a snapshot in American history and is not the only story of the Jews of Selma. I'll offer a few words about it this evening as context for our larger story, but we'll spend the majority of our time talking about the congregation in Selma and how they are today. Like most other white Southerners, Jewish Selmians were divided and included both segregationists and integrationists. This stance was not unique to Selma's Jewish community, as it mirrored many of the other Southern Jewish congregations that I've studied. In January 1956, members of Selma's B'nai B'rith Lodge issued a public statement asking groups like the American Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee to stop intervening in affairs outside of Jewish causes, particularly civil rights issues. Often the statement is used to condemn Selma's Jewish community, when in reality, it represents a feeling of anxiety experienced by many Southern Jews of the time. The statement, when read in this context, does not take a stand against integration. Rather, it asks for Northern-dominated Jewish groups to stop intervening in Southern Jewish affairs. I offer this not as an excuse to the beliefs or behaviors of segregationists, but rather to contextualize the tension experienced by small Southern Jewish communities. As one of my interviewees said, they come on in with guns ablazing, but they don't know the lay of the land. They didn't stop for a minute to think about what a mess they left behind for us to clean up. They go home, but we remain. Across countless interviews, I heard that same sentiment. When Northeastern Jewish organizations come to Selma, proudly identifying themselves as Jewish, they can make it difficult for the local community to distinguish between the organizations and the politics of the temple. While many, if not most, of my interviewees saw themselves and their families as integrationists, many spoke about the fear that they felt as being next in line, or an acute understanding that they are still considered other as Jews, even though the community accepts them and they felt safe. Fearful that their businesses could be boycotted or even destroyed, many of Selma's Jewish community stayed silent on issues of civil rights. This was especially true among those who had stronger ties to the Holocaust, either as survivors or who had other kinship ties. Having just barely gotten their feet under them after the war, these individuals were understandably the least likely to be vocal about integration. Despite their relative silence, over 80% of Selma's Jewish community identified as being integrationist at the time. This is in contrast to an estimated 30% of the white population of Alabama. Personal manifestations of integrationist or segregationist beliefs were largely separate from the temple, which took no official policy or stance. The most prominent storyline of Selma's Jewish community and civil rights is, unfortunately, a segregationist one. Saul Tepper was an ardent segregationist, most recently profiled in the highly popular NPR series, White Lies. So I get a lot of questions about him, which is why I address it this evening. Tepper was a member of Selma's White Citizens Council, the author of countless opinion pieces and editorials in the Selma Times-Journal, and stood as part of the sheriff's posse at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, poised to attack and heavily involved in the riots that ensued during the bridge crossings and march between Selma and Montgomery. Tepper would even go on to write letters to Jewish integrationists saying, "I'm proud of my Jewish heritage. I'm not proud that you call yourself a Jew. In fact, I would say that you are not." But is this really the story of civil rights for Selma's Jewish community? Indeed, Tepper stands as the perfect foe to the beloved Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a reminder that there is both good and bad in our Jewish communities. Too often, though, We are quick to latch onto a story that gives us a good headline, forgetting that there's also so much good in Selma, and that Tepper's opinions did not match the views of the majority of Selma's Jewish community. As I've collected memories and stories, two in particular stand out, and I would like to offer them as my first snapshots in a series of storytelling photographs of Selma's Jewish community. I should mention, I've changed the names and other identifying information in a few of these stories at the request of the person being interviewed. My Selma friends who are listening will surely be able to recognize each other, and I assure them I have not forgotten anyone's name. Snapshot 1. Nicolette and her daughter Jean are both on the phone with me. We're well into our third hour, and although Jean and I are beginning to fatigue, 94-year-old Nicolette continues on. I've got some things to say before it's too late, she confides. She tells us a story about delivering sack lunches to the Black women lined up to vote outside of the courthouse. Initially, her mother had sent her to deliver them just to the women that they employed. But when she realized that no one was eating for fear of losing their place in line, she returned with more food. You know us, Jews just like to feed people, she laughs. Her daughter, clearly touched by this story that she was hearing for the first time, asks if there were other things that she remembered from those years. Nicolette pauses and then says, you know, there was a mystery letter writer who kept writing to the newspaper anonymously. They were asking folks to pave the road that many of the Black workers had to travel on. I had just come home from college and thought I knew a lot about everything, and I wrote those letters. I didn't stop until that road got paved. Going back and reviewing the newspaper archives, I found the letters, and they were everything that you would hope a fresh-faced 19-year-old trying to change the world would write. Snapshot 2. I'm eating downtown at my favorite restaurant called, of course, the Downtowner. I'm having my usual, the vegetable plate, and a half and half tea. I don't even have to order anymore. Before too long, someone stops to chat. It's rare that I eat a meal alone in Selma, even though I'm an outsider. She tells me that she heard about my research while she was at the library, which is just across the street, and Becky sent her over to find me. She remembers going to Barton's store to cash checks with her mama. Barton's not only was an important store for the community, but also was important because of the role that it played socially. She remembers that her mother struggled to find places to cash the checks that she earned as a household cook. They would go to Barton's, cash their checks, and shop. She remembers that Barton's was a place where they felt welcome as Black customers, and tells me that she knows Jews understand just a little bit better what it's like to have people hate you. Plus, she said, the Jewish stores had the best Christmas displays in town. Snapshot 3. The temple hasn't had a rabbi in over 50 years. I'm standing in the old rabbi's office looking through papers, and I notice that Ronnie is running his hands along a spot on the wall. I ask him what he's doing, and he tells me he's checking to see if the wall's hot. The temple still has its original knob and tube wiring. What's more, it has the original slate roof. Ronnie comes by pretty much every day to take care of the building and to, as he says, make sure everything's still standing. He's the youngest remaining member of the congregation, and the temple is more than just a retirement project. Ronnie is an unstoppable force, and I know that he's listening tonight and groaning at me lauding his work. A retired entrepreneur and local businessman, he's on the board of the YMCA, was recently honored by his alma mater as the Alumni Volunteer of the Year, and quite literally keeps the synagogue open as a one-man show. When tour groups come, Ronnie arrives early, cleans the bathroom, sets up the chairs and tables, offers them a history lesson and answers questions along with Hannah, and then cleans up afterwards, and all for free. Walking around Selma with him makes me feel almost famous. He knows everyone, and everyone likes him. And now he's assembled an advisory board and is working to dream big dreams for the temple's future. But in this private moment, I see a man who's given his life to his community, to preserving their temple home, and who is quietly worrying about whether or not that old wiring will cause damage. Snapshot 4. Ronnie and his wife Barbara have driven over an hour with me to take me to visit Ed in a nursing home. He's in his early 90s. He's forgotten that we're coming to visit and is napping, but he awakens when we arrive, and he chats freely, sharing his feelings of sadness that the temple is so small. We tell him that he fought the good fight for the temple, that it stayed alive for a long time because of him, because he was a lay leader who held services, because he buried and married his congregation without a rabbi, because he gave the community everything he could as he served as temple president for so many years. He shrugs. Barbara, who's with me, says to him, "Ed, you should be real proud of what you did." And Ed says, "Pride isn't a virtue." We all laugh, and then he adds quietly, almost under his breath, "I guess I am kind of proud." 6 months later, I return to visit him again, this time with Ronnie and Charles. He slips in and out of sleep during our visit as we sit by his bedside. Deep down, I think we all know that this might be the last time we see him. And he dies 1 week later. He had buried members of his own congregation for years, and now it's time for them to do the same for him. In one conversation about his funeral plans, someone asks me if I think it matters if he has a minyan for his burial. We all agree that God won't judge a congregation that doesn't have 10 members for not having a minyan. Still, just to be on the safe side, my synagogue in Norfolk, Virginia says the mourner's Kaddish for Ed. Snapshot 5. Steve moved to Selma for work, and having been raised in an Orthodox family, he could chant and conduct services. The temple was revitalized. Then, just a few years after he moved to Selma, he tried to rescue his dog from the street, and he was killed by an oncoming car. The temple lost 1/6 of its membership that day, and its last remaining fluent Hebrew reader. Snapshot 6. It is 5:15 in the morning, and Ronnie's pickup truck pulls up in front of the house that I rent in Selma. We are not morning people, and we ride together in silence, something that's rare for the two of us. We're working with a production team to capture images of the temple, and they want to photograph the building at sunrise. While we're standing there, they then tell us that they want to meet again at sunset so that we could take photographs of one of the 2 Jewish cemeteries. They say we'll get perfect natural light. I'll let you imagine the look on our faces when they tell us that idea. The early days of summer and spring are long, and we are bleary-eyed from the long day of photography and heat. The photography team directs us, and Ronnie and I are poised, ready with our cameras. You see, that's part of the team's artistic vision and commitment, that people create their own images of the town. Actually, the images that you see tonight were all taken by me and Ronnie during this marathon crash course in documentary photography, something Ronnie probably still regrets letting me talk him into. The professional photographer suggests we get shots of the dusky light coming through the draping Spanish moss of the cemetery. When we look at the images later, we know they were right. The light is amazing. As we work, covered in bug bites and an inexplicable amount of grass, Ronnie clears the gravestones of any debris that has fallen since his last visit. He talks about coming out to power wash the stones, and I realize this is one more thing that he's responsible for. We stop in front of Ed's grave. It's clearly newer than the other graves, and his date of death is not even yet added to the stone. We place a rock on his headstone and one on the other side for his wife, Connie, and we stand there for a moment in silence. Finally, it's too dark to take any more photographs, so we stop for a pizza on the way home. Half with meat for Ronnie and half with veggie for me. A perfect team, just like us, and a reward for a long day of documenting Jewish Selma together. Snapshot 7. Hannah had prepared a huge spread of Israeli food for me. I knew this had been a massive undertaking, and I was so grateful. We sat at the supper table and spent hours chatting about everything from books to politics. I had found a kindred spirit. As an ethnographer, we're instructed to keep a critical distance from our research. I knew in that moment that I was a goner. Hannah feels like family and a best friend rolled all into one. I truly delight in our conversations, and I knew that that would be the first of many. Hannah is a lifelong educator and learner. When she speaks with groups that visit the temple, she shines when working with children and young adults who gravitate towards her teaching and speaking style. She downplays this when I talk to her, but watching her and Ronnie tell the story of the Jews of Selma to visitors is a joy. Not only does their knowledge shine through, but so does their ability to connect to their audience, to make the story relevant, and to inspire folks across generations. Prior to the global pandemic, an image that haunted me was of Hannah sitting alone in her house on a Friday evening, streaming services from synagogues out of state. The thought of Hannah, the daughter of Holocaust survivors, responding to a digital rabbi and congregation that was unaware of her presence didn't sit easy with me. Now, in an age of quarantine, there are so many more ways that we can connect digitally, and congregations are more aware than ever that not everyone participating is actually in the pews. Moreover, digital communication has enabled me to talk to Hannah several times a week. Although she'd hate me saying it, Hannah is the spiritual guide of the congregation. She thoughtfully cares for both the physical and emotional needs of Temple Mishkan Israel, dropping off soup when folks are sick, calling to check in, planning holidays and services, including ones where she plays her flute to provide beautiful musical accompaniment. And when needed, performing thoughtful and beautiful funeral ceremonies for her congregation. Hannah takes time to think more about doing things Jewishly than most American Jews do, because she has to. When you don't have a rabbi running the temple, someone has to figure out what to read for Rosh Hashanah. And at Temple Mishkan Israel, Hannah shoulders that responsibility. Snapshot 8. Charles's father died in 1936, and his mother somehow escaped with their son and daughter out of Austria through Lithuania and to Selma, Alabama. He was 8 years old when he arrived in the United States. He tells me in his thick Alabama accent that no one believes him when he tells them that he grew up speaking German. I'm so struck by the bravery and tenacity of his mother, and he laughs and says, "I guess she was a strong Southern woman even before we had moved to the South." Recently, Charles turned 90 during quarantine, and his friends and family did a drive-by birthday party. The local paper ran a spread about his life story, talking about how he was a Korean War vet and an Army tank commander prior to returning to Selma. It's obvious how loved he is, not only by his temple, but also throughout the entire city. Snapshot 9. Joni's family owned a candy company, and folks in Selma love to tell me about how they remember the sweet smells hanging in the air. We meet to talk at the library after she had just finished volunteering. Our conversation meanders, but she says something that stayed with me. She told me, Selma has done more for civil rights than civil rights ever did for Selma. She's not without hope, though. Even until the weeks before her recent passing, she encouraged me and others to continue to tell the story of Jewish Selma, to continue to give back to our communities and help those most in need. When I ask her what she wants for the future of the temple, she says, "We don't know what the future holds, Amy, but we can only hope that we are remembered for our continuous hope." Snapshot 10. In January 2020, shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic, we gather in Birmingham, Alabama. Temple Mishkan Israel has reconvened its board made up of what we call the Temple family, folks who grew up in Selma at the temple or who have other connections to it. Although it wasn't the magnitude of the previous Temple family reunions, which brought in hundreds, this still feels like a homecoming of sorts. We worked for 2 days to dream and envision together. Last week, we also sat for 2 days on Zoom, and I do mean 2 entire long days. We've met throughout the pandemic and are taking steps forward. As I listened to the conversations, it became clear to me that the heart of the Jewish community of Selma hasn't changed. The conversations talked about how we shouldn't preserve a building just to preserve an empty building. Instead, how can we use the building to give back and contribute to Selma while still retaining its Jewishness? How can the Jewish community ensure that its legacy is one of caring and investing in the city that it loves? I couldn't help but think that that was exactly what previous generations of Temple Mishkan Israel would have wanted as their legacy. A new generation, even if not living in Selma, still identifying as Jewish, that wants to give back to the city. I've met with countless people who grew up in Selma, have family there, or other Jewish ties to the community. I've talked with church folks who attend every event at the temple to support their Jewish friends, and I've been collecting their stories that remind us all that in the moments when it's hardest to be a Jew, and the moments when it's easiest to give up, the Jews of Selma have continued on. They remain a committed community, caring for each other and caring for their larger Selmian community. You may be asking, how is this story different than other tales of small Jewish communities in the South that have had their children move away? It differs in a few ways, most notably in its continued investment in the city by the extended family who no longer lives there. It also differs because of its placement in the heart of civil rights history, drawing an interest from outsiders who visit the city. And it differs because the temple has defied many odds and role modeled how the congregation has adapted and changed to meet the needs of both its members and of its larger city. While other congregations that I've studied dig their heels in and refuse to change, Temple Mishkan Israel continues to evolve. And the proof of its vitality is in the continued interest and visitation to the building. Simply put, Temple Mishkan Israel matters to Jews outside of Selma, and it matters to non-Jews who visit or who live in Selma. As I study the congregation, in many ways, the building itself becomes her own character in the story. This is not a sad story. Although it is a story that talks honestly and vulnerably about the inevitable end of human life and the struggles of a small congregation in the Deep South. But more importantly, it's a story of a dream fulfilled, the story of Jews fleeing persecution and settling in Alabama, of pursuing and achieving the American dream for themselves and for their children, and of establishing a deeply rooted community, creating a home that their children and grandchildren want to come back to time and time again, a place that even strangers come to feel like family. Yes, it's true that there are few Jews left in Selma, but there's a large national Selma family that still sees their Jewishness, their families, and their identities tied to a small town in the Black Belt of Alabama. Selma's Jews dream of the next chapter of their story, and I'm honored to be the one entrusted to help recount this tale. And I hope that if you have felt inspired by their story, that you'll follow the temple on Facebook to keep up with their renovation efforts and the news of the congregation. Just like the remaining 3 members of Temple Mishkan Israel, I don't know with certainty what will come next, but I know that I will be there every step of the way. So instead of me summing it up, let me share with you the words of Richard Rosenberg, a temple member who passed away in 2017. He was asked, "How many of your friends and family are still in Selma?" "None," he replies. "So why do you still care about this temple?" He responded, "Do you ever stop loving home? It's where I belong." Maybe I'll come to find a little piece of home and belonging in Selma too. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Amy. We have a couple of minutes where we can take questions. And so what I would suggest, I see already 2 people raise their hands, and you can use the Q&A function to type in your questions or the chat. And I will try to find all of your questions, and either by allowing you to speak or by letting your, or by reading your questions. So, Phil, you raised your arm already a long time ago, so I just asked you to ask your question. And I just unmuted you, so you can.
You just unmuted me. It was not a question. It was just, I'm very proud of my cousin, Ronnie Leet, who I guess is the youngest member of the congregation. I'm the president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we had a Leet reunion, and it was so nice to get to know Ronnie, and so it's not a question. It's just I'm very proud of him. That's all.
Ronnie definitely deserves that shout out, Phil. He is amazing, and he's done so much in working with the board and in taking care of the temple. It wouldn't be there without him.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
I saw a question, Ruth, about if there's still a Sephardic Jewish community in Selma. At this point, I think everyone who's in Selma would identify as being Ashkenazi, but certainly historically, there were strong Sephardic roots. But the 3 Jews who are still in Selma would identify as being Ashkenazi.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear you.
Yeah, my question is, what was the largest Jewish population in Selma? I mean, how many Jews? What was the largest Jewish population at what time? You're saying in the 40s probably?
Yeah, in the 40s, the peak was 104 households. So I don't know exactly how many folks were in each household. So I'm estimating that most households, some have one, but some might have up to three. So it could be anywhere between 200 and 300 folks.
Thank you.
Kim had a question, and I would let Kim talk. Kim, you're muted. So while we're working on this, Bill Ferris had another question. Is there a plan for the future of the beautiful temple? What happened to the chandelier?
The chandelier, I believe, and someone from Selma can correct me, it's before my time, I believe that it fell, it predates me. As far as the plan for the future of the temple, that's what the board is really actively working on right now. So there are numerous people working, and I think that hopefully soon we'll be able to announce a little bit more concrete. I don't want to sort of jump the gun with what the ideas are, but it is very much already in motion. So there's been a significant amount of fundraising started, preserving the building. It's already listed on a National Historic Place, and there's a lot of discussion about what the next iteration will look like to continue giving back to the community, to tell the story of the Jewish community of Selma, and to make sure that the building is still vibrant and that folks are coming in and out and it's not just an edifice sitting on a street.
Right, and Marcy followed up with a question. You might have told us, but does the synagogue have any partnership with state and local historic preservation efforts? And she's very excited about your work there.
Hey, Marcy, it's good to see you. There's several of these partnerships happening, and especially in Selma, working with the other preservation efforts that the city has to make sure that it's in line with contributing to the city's efforts as well.
And Alan, I just would like to, would you like to ask a question? Alan, we cannot hear you. So then I'm reading the question of Alice, and is the congregation working actively with either MSJE or another organization to help the congregation make sure the religious objects get taken care of?
Yeah, so that's all part of what the board is working on right now, is making sure that the religious objects are treated with the respect that they deserve, and that any other objects are placed either in a museum or in an archive to make sure that everything is where it ought to be. Ruth, I see that there's a couple questions too about why folks are leaving or why folks left Selma. And I want to make sure that I address that. I think that it's very much the story that a lot of Southern congregations, especially small ones, experience, which is the American dream, right? So folks came and they built their lives so that their children could then go on to do what they perceived as the next best thing, right? So they maintained the stores to earn money, to send their kids to college, and then they wanted their children to have these experiences. And Selma is a smaller town, and it doesn't have a ton of industry. So a lot of folks chose after college to take jobs elsewhere and raise their families or start their families there and plant roots in a different city. It's astounding how many children and grandchildren still come back to Selma regularly and still really care, even after their parents or grandparents are no longer living, but they haven't chosen to live in the city, I think mainly for financial and career opportunities.
And Erwin has the question, the temple appears to be extremely well maintained. Who supports that level of maintenance?
Ronnie, among others. So folks have, of course, generously given to the temple so that we're able to maintain the building, but Ronnie does really make sure that the building is being upkept. And prior to Ronnie, other great temple presidents who really invested in the building and made sure that they stayed on track of it. I think, like I said, the building is really the other character in this story. And I don't usually use a Zoom background, but she's so pretty, I had to put her there this evening. I think that when you have a building that is so much of a treasure, you really care for it. And the temple itself is just lucky that the congregation has been able to sustain that and support it.
And following the last question is, how is the cemetery being cared for?
A couple different ways. So one of the cemeteries is actually part of a city cemetery. Selma's city cemeteries are struggling with upkeep right now because of some budget cuts. So there is a cemetery preservation society that's a volunteer group, but a lot of that work, again, does come from the temple community and family. Again, Ronnie and others who visit. There have been some Jewish youth groups who have come and done some work with cleaning stones, but by and large, it's incredibly well maintained. Families visit and other folks, Selmians, chip in and help each other out. So that's a really great thing in the city to see.
And Phil, who wanted to ask a question right from the beginning, is typed now the question. So can the synagogue be rented out for various occasions to make money to sustain?
That's on the table right now. So the temple board has talked about that. Right now, I don't think that the temple's really doing that. But they did a few years ago, and this often is one of my snapshots, but I didn't have enough time tonight. There were two young boys from Maryland whose grandparents were from Selma, and they had their bar mitzvahs at two different occasions in Selma, which was a really joyous occasion to see young folks coming of age in the temple again. So there is precedent for some life cycle events like that happening in the temple, but as far as larger rentals, that's not been happening yet.
And there was another question about a functioning synagogue.
Is it a functioning synagogue? I mean, yeah, the three members are still there and celebrating holidays and events. So yeah, I think it's functioning. I mean, obviously there's not a minyan and there's not a rabbi, but my personal opinion is when you gather intentionally together to do things Jewishly, then you're a congregation.
And Leonard Rogoff has the question, could you tell us more about how the Selma diaspora maintains their ties to the community? Do they return for reunions, contribute to a temple or cemetery fund?
Hi, Leonard, it's good to see you virtually, even though I can't see your face. That's a great question. There are a couple of different ways. So there's been two large homecoming events, Home for the Holidays, that were largely spearheaded by the Barton family, and that brought a lot of people back to Selma to worship and celebrate together and have a big family, temple family reunion. I think that now a lot of the ways that the temple stays in contact with each other are virtual because folks are spread out from California to New York and all over in between. We do have an extended family Facebook page. We have an extended family directory. The actual Facebook page for the temple, I think, is a great way for people to unite. So I think it's just that intentional contact and still a really strong identification with the identity of being Selma family. And that means not just your direct kinship ties to cousins, but also sort of a larger tie to the congregational family. I don't know if I got all of that question.
So, and I think Ronnie has a question, and I just let him talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Ronnie.
Hey, Amy. Listen, I do not have a question, but I have an important statement. First of all, thank you, Amy, for those kind words, and to my cousin in Tulsa, Phil, for his kind words. But it is important to know that as Amy is a member of our 15-person board, We really have an active board. They're spread across the country, led by Mike Siegel, who lives in New Orleans, as our board president. And this group, our board group, is the board that's going to lead us to our end goal, which is restoration of our 121-year-old building and establish some type of legacy for programs for the Jewish story. So even though a lot was said about me, it's not about me. It's about our wonderful board that has just, over the last few years, has become extremely active and motivated and devoted to making sure that the Jewish story of Selma lives on, and this beautiful building lives on for a long and prosperous future. So I am appreciative of the words that were spoken, but it's the weight does fall on our board, and it's a great board. And again, it's these people are living across the country. Most all of them were born and raised in Selma, so they feel the feeling of love for our history and our building. So I just needed to say that. So that's it.
So Amy, because we are running short of time, but there are a couple of questions about the architecture. Someone asked about the architectural style, and also Jack Sassoon wanted to know about the stained glass windows. When, how many, themes? It sounds like another talk, but
the short and quick version of that is that it's a Romanesque revival is the style of the building. As far as the stained glass windows, one thing that is pretty unique about them is that they have a lot of actual bodies of people in them, which is pretty cool to see. And there are different biblical themes. So there's one of Ruth, for example. And you can see the exterior, like forward-facing window next to me there. And that stained glass, for example, says Adonai Echad, so a line from the Shema. And what's interesting about it is that it's facing outwards, so you can read it from the street. And so when you're inside, it's actually reversed, which I think speaks to the understanding when the temple was built that people were on the street and they were reading the Hebrew and they knew what it said, rather than being interior focused for who was actually inside.
yeah, and so the last question is from Beth, and I think this is the question probably everyone has here in the room. When will be the book out?
Well, that is a great question. And I'm sitting on it. It's 2022, 2023, early 2023. I thought that I was going to be done. This started out as what I thought was going to be a 5-week summer project. Then it was a 5-year project. And I was ready to go with my manuscript. And then the board reinvigorated and started making some wonderful changes. And I think all ethnographers struggle with this. When do you stop the story? And I don't feel like the story's quite ready to stop yet. So luckily I have a very generous editor who understands that and is willing to ride out with me for a little bit longer.
But the good news is it's going to be a book. So Amy, thank you so much. There's so many things and so many more questions in the chat. So I think there's definitely be more material for further talks. Thank you so much for joining us in North Carolina tonight. And thank you for everyone else who came to this event. We will have more events. Please come and visit our website, and there you can find the next event is going to be already on the 15th of March.